All right, let's talk about head trauma. So, head trauma, or traumatic brain injury in particular, is what we're going to be talking about, is super prevalent in Canada, North America. It's a high cause of death in Canada and disability, and will probably remain that way for the next really long time, and we'll talk about the reasons why that is. So, in the age 65 and above, there's a huge difference in mortality rates, meaning it is much easier to die from a traumatic brain injury above 65. And actually, above 65 represents a population that is often exposed to traumatic brain injuries. So, as always, let's talk about some anatomy and physiology before we get started. So first of all, your skull has many different parts, but the part that contains your brain is pretty basic. It's the cranial vault. We'll follow it with the red line here. And it is a container with only one hole, and that hole is down here. That's where your spinal cord comes out of. It's called foramen magnum. Your spinal cord goes through there and then throughout the rest of your body. The thing you want to keep in mind with the cranial vault is it does not move. Your skull is completely not malleable, or at least it should not be. And that means that there's a finite amount of space, and there is really no room, or very little room, for an excess of fluid, or an excess of pressure, or an excess of blood, or an excess of anything, brain tissue, tumor, anything like that. So it's a really nice close-knit system, and it works well so long as there's absolutely no insult, injury, or intrusion. Within that cavity, you have your actual blood, right? Because your brain needs to both be fed oxygen and get rid of waste like carbon dioxide. You have your brain tissue itself, and you have your intracranial fluid, which gets rid of wastes and stuff like that, and it's in between the ventricles of your brain. It also somewhat cushions your brain. So your brain is an amazing organ, and it comes up all the time when you're talking about pathologies that affect it. But this statistic is really cool for a couple of reasons. So the brain accounts for, it consumes 20% of the total oxygen requirements of the body. That's insane. So 20% of the oxygen you take in is solely necessary for your brain to function, and about 15% of your cardiac output is necessary to feed your brain. What you should take away from that, at least for this lecture, is your brain needs fuel on a moment-to-moment basis, and it really, really does not tolerate well a lack of oxygen at all. It doesn't tolerate it well at all, and it doesn't tolerate it for even a moment of time. So on a moment-to-moment basis, if you feel your carotid artery right now beating, every single beat, your brain consumes about 20% of that oxygen, and you need it. And if it dips in even the slightest amount, brain function will immediately decrease. So it suffices to say that if not enough blood is reaching the brain is dying immediately, and it will not tolerate that long. Let's actually define traumatic brain injury. So really basic definition before talking about even what's happening. Traumatic brain injuries can be defined in the field by your patient's Glasgow Coma Scale. So you go to a scene, patient has a mechanism of injury suggesting a traumatic brain injury, so we'll keep it simple and just say motor vehicle collision. And you find him, and he's a GCS of 9. You could real quickly look at his GCS of 9 and use this scoring system to determine if he's a mild, moderate, or severe traumatic brain injury. So if he was a GCS of 9, like we said, then he would be considered a moderate traumatic brain injury. That's a really basic way to categorize traumatic brain injuries, and it gets much more complicated than that once the patient arrives at the hospital and other tests are done. But as a paramedic, this is the only system we have, and it's the only system we use to determine people's traumatic brain injuries. Something to note, and it might be kind of obvious, but the more severe the traumatic brain injury, the higher the mortality rate becomes. So 25 to 35% of adults with a traumatic brain injury considered severe, so a GCS of 3 to 8, will die approximately. That's the mortality rate. So not a very high survival rate for people with a severe traumatic brain injury. All right, so let's start talking about your brain and make sure that we have the basics down before we get into how complicated this gets. So your brain, like we said, is in your cranial vault, right? So your cranial vault, this black thing here, is going to represent your skull, and then the green stuff will represent both intracranial fluid and brain, and then the red stuff, well, that's obviously blood. So we already mentioned that those are the three things that are in your skull: brain tissue, intracranial fluid, blood. Okay. Let's say everything is absolutely fine. You're a normal human being. You're sitting here watching this video. There's nothing wrong with you at all, as far as you know. Then your intracranial pressure, the amount of pressure within your skull, is, with all that fluid moving around, with all that brain tissue, is somewhere between 7 to 15 millimeters of mercury. And that's good and that's fine, and everybody's happy about that. So there is always a certain amount of pressure within your head. That pressure does change within that range, and that is okay. And your brain has, or your skull and brain and tissue have many different ways to regulate that pressure to ensure that it does not become a problem. So long as you're somewhere between 7 and 15 and you're constantly chasing homeostasis, then you're okay. Having said that, let's talk about mean arterial pressure. Mean arterial pressure is something you need to know for a million reasons, but we're going to focus on what it is and why we care about it in relation to head trauma. So mean arterial pressure is, let's talk about, before we even get into that, what your systolic blood pressure is and your diastolic blood pressure is, because those are pretty easy to capture. So your systolic blood pressure, everybody knows how to take a blood pressure, right? If you feel your carotid pulse right now and you feel that boom, that beat, that actual pulse pushing against your fingers, that's the blood flowing out of your left ventricle into your aorta and immediately pushing against the arterial wall. So that's what a pulse is. All right, so if you were to measure the strength with which the blood hits the arterial wall, you would have your systolic blood pressure. That is what a blood pressure cuff does, by the way. You cut off until absolutely no blood goes through, and then you let off the pressure on your arm, and the moment a little bit of blood goes through, you know that is the approximate pressure of the blood hitting the arterial wall. So let's say that's 120 millimeters of mercury. That's your systolic blood pressure. All right, your diastolic blood pressure is when the entire cardiac cycle is done and the entire heart is at rest and all the arteries are at rest and absolutely no or very little movement of blood is happening. What is now the pressure of the blood against the arterial wall? That's your diastolic blood pressure. And it should be much lower than systolic, generally speaking, and it should be below 100, generally speaking. So let's say that's 80 millimeters of mercury. We in Ontario use systolic blood pressure as a predictor of your circulatory status. Can you perfuse your major organs? So long as you have a blood pressure over 90, we say yes. That's the way we do it for now. Mean arterial pressure is actually a much better indication of your ability to perfuse organs, and most medical professionals use that to determine whether interventions need to happen. So then what is it? Well, it's what it sounds like. Your mean arterial pressure is not your systolic, not your diastolic, but what is happening in between there? What is the average pressure of blood in your arteries at any given time? That's what mean arterial pressure is. And that can change based on the difference between your systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So it's a much more accurate predictor of circulatory status. And it's something that you'll probably end up using in the future. I imagine Ontario will change medical directives to include that as opposed to systolic blood pressure. So how do you calculate mean arterial pressure then? Well, if you're a working paramedic, your monitor does it for you, and you'll get your systolic, your diastolic, and then in the little corner, you'll get your mean arterial pressure. Your monitor does do this actual mathematical calculation, but it just does it very quickly and efficiently. So realistically, you should have it all the time. If you're a critical care paramedic, or above being on the road paramedic, you might actually have an arterial line. That gives you a live feed of your mean arterial pressure, and that's pretty cool. Are we going to have that on land? I don't think that would ever happen. So we can calculate our mean arterial pressure, and if you're a student in particular, you have to know not only this calculation, but how to do it. It will definitely be something you see frequently. So it is your diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of your systolic blood pressure minus your diastolic blood pressure. So let's just actually do this. So let's say textbook guy, right? So 120 over 80. So 80 is your diastolic, and then it's plus 1/3 of 120 minus 80. So 120 minus 80 is 40. So now we just do 40 divided by 3, which you would use a calculator for, is 13.3. 80 plus 13.3 is 93.3 millimeters of mercury. A normal range of MAP is 70 to 110. You will need to remember these values for exams. Otherwise, they're not as important to understanding the concept we're about to talk about. What you really need to understand is your mean arterial pressure is dependent on the difference between your systolic and diastolic, and it is a predictor of your ability to perfuse organs, and it is your average blood pressure at any time. Keep that in mind. Okay, so we talked about intracranial pressure. We talked about mean arterial pressure. They're pretty basic concepts. So now let's talk about something called cerebral perfusion pressure. It's a little bit more complicated. So cerebral perfusion pressure is, let's just talk about this. How does blood get into your head? Well, it goes up your carotid arteries, right? You've got your vertebral arteries, but let's keep it simple and just say these are your two carotid arteries. Well, let's say your mean arterial pressure is 90, because that's fine, and that's pretty normal. So let's say it's 90. Well, when that pressure of 90 reaches the skull, it's going to be naturally opposed by the intracranial pressure we already mentioned, right? You could think of your head like a basketball that's already filled with air. To put more air in that basketball, you need to overcome the pressure of air that is already in the basketball. In this case, the air would be intracranial pressure of 7.5 to 15. Well, if your mean arterial pressure is 90, hey, we got a lot of room to play with, don't we? So let's just say it's 90, and you can overcome that pressure. As long as you can overcome it, blood will get into your brain, and everybody's happy. We want to know what that pressure is because it tells you how much blood is getting into your head and is therefore a good predictor of how perfused your brain is. So basically, the better your cerebral perfusion pressure, the better the actual perfusion of the brain is. The more oxygen it's getting, the more carbon dioxide it's getting rid of, and the more glucose it can metabolize. You need a good cerebral perfusion pressure for your brain to work. And keeping in mind what we talked about earlier, your brain uses 20% of all the oxygen in your body at a given moment. So if cerebral perfusion pressure drops, it's not going to be able to get the oxygen it needs. So let's talk about this as a mathematical formula because you do need to memorize it. And it is how you calculate your actual cerebral perfusion pressure. So cerebral perfusion pressure equals mean arterial pressure minus your intracranial pressure. And that makes sense. So let's actually just break this down mathematically, and we'll keep the same example of regular Joe guy with a blood pressure of 120 over 80. So we already calculated his mean arterial pressure as 93.3, which means the average pressure in his blood vessel at any time is 93.3 millimeters of mercury. So this carotid artery going up into the brain is doing so with a pressure of 93.3. It is going to immediately be opposed by the intracranial pressure, which in this case is 15 millimeters of mercury, right? Makes sense. Okay, cool. So in order to overcome that pressure, it must be higher. So what you do is you take that 93.3 and you minus 15 millimeters of mercury, because that's what's necessary to overcome. And what you're left with is your actual cerebral perfusion pressure of 78.3. Now you know the amount of pressure with which blood is entering the brain, which once again is a great predictor of how much the brain is being perfused with oxygen, glucose, and able to get rid of waste like EtCO2. So if you have a cerebral perfusion pressure under 60, that's generally associated with hypoxia and brain tissue damage. Can we measure cerebral perfusion pressure in the field? No. Is there a way to do it? Yeah, but even in the medical field, it's actually quite complicated and not many medical professionals do it. Anesthesiologists do, and there's certain other really high intensity situations under which it would be measured. As a paramedic, especially as a land paramedic, you'll generally never see that. But you'll see there are ways that we can determine that somebody's cerebral perfusion pressure is clearly dropping. So all this is the basics that you must understand before you can understand what is actually happening to your brain during a traumatic brain injury. So check out video part 2 on head trauma on Paramedic Prep Program on YouTube, and subscribe for more videos like this.